It is my great pleasure today to welcome you all to hear a talk by Dr. Dexter Gabriel, who is an assistant professor in the History Department and in the Africana Studies Institute. He earned his BA and MA in History from Texas State University, San Marcos, and his PhD in History from Stony Brook University, New York, where in 2016 he was awarded the Fred Weinstein Award for the Best Dissertation Chapter. I love that because it's like just a chapter. Like, can I ask which one it was?
I don't know. I have no idea. They just contacted me after the fact and said, hey, you won this thing. I said, is there money involved? Yeah, this is great.
Awesome. All right. Let's just say the chapters. I'll extend it to all of them. That's fabulous. More recently, Gabriel was awarded the Kate E. and Hall J. Peterson Fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society and the Benjamin F. Stevens Fellowships at the Massachusetts Historical Society. His research interests include the history of bondage, resistance, and freedom in the Black Atlantic, as well as interdisciplinary approaches to slavery within popular culture and media. And actually, just this year, he has a wonderful article out about Quentin Tarantino and a book that came out from the University of Tennessee, a collected essays. His current research project, which we will be hearing about today, explores British emancipation in the Anglo-Caribbean and its impact on abolitionist strategies in 19th century North America. Please join me in welcoming Dexter Gabriel.
Thank you, everyone who came out today, this week before spring break, in which you're giving exams or students are scarce. Thank you for coming. I'm here to talk today about my book project, Jubilee's Experiment, the British West Indies and American Abolitionism. It examines how the emancipated British Caribbean colonies entered into the debates over abolition and African American citizenship in the United States from the 1830s through the 1860s. It analyzes this public discourse as both propaganda and rhetoric created by abolitionists, black and white, in antebellum America. Concurrently, it interweaves the lived experiences of the former slaves in the West Indies, their acts of resistance and struggles for greater freedoms, which complicated this ongoing debate. So that's the grander narrative of my work. Today I'm going to be drawing from a chapter I've been working on that details the emancipation movement in England and the early debates in print it sparked between American abolitionists and pro-slavery writers over what was called the experiment in the West Indies. It also explores the role of enslaved people in the West Indies in spearheading a vanguard of revolutionary emancipation and the alarm this induced in both the Caribbean, the English metropole, and the United States. So more specifically, in the next 30, 40-ish minutes, I'm going to look at fears of, quote, moral contagion and the West Indies in the United States, the transatlantic connections during the transformation of American abolitionism, and then take you through an anti-abolition riot in New York in the fall of 1833. As I argue, these tumultuous events were directly related to fears of national and racial boundary crossings that grew out of anxieties over British emancipation in the West Indies and its influence and impact on America. Hence, I've come up with this eye-catching title for today, and may drench America in blood. And I even got a little fancy, put the blood in there. Then you see here on this first slide, there's a picture here of this coin commemorating British emancipation. It says Jubilee, August 1st, 1834. It shows a former slave now free. You can see hanging from his arms are chains. Behind him are, anybody can see what those are, there are palm trees and examples of sugarcane to let you know this is the West Indies. Whenever you see, remember that when you see palm trees or such things, they're indicating the West Indies or hints of sugarcane. And he's standing on, you may not be able to see this, but he's standing on whips and rods, right? So he's trotting down these symbols of slavery. And this was, the hole above him is not actually the sun, those are sun rays, or maybe they meant it to be both, but it's actually a hole to be, it's a coin that would be held so people would wear it. And so this is one of these symbols that abolitionists created during this period. So I'm going to start all of this with a pictorial. There we go. And unfortunately, you can't see this as well, so you'll just have to take my word on what's going on here. This pictorial is called Immediate Emancipation Illustrated. And what I mean here by immediate emancipation, I'll be using this a lot, as well as the term immediatism. This is the period of transformation of American abolitionism, where we're going to see abolitionists and anti-slavery figures now pushing more so for an immediate end to slavery rather than the earlier gradual attempts, the attempts at gradual emancipation. So this is the big difference here. So this is a pictorial called Immediate Emancipation Illustrated. In November 1833, this lithograph appeared on the main streets of New York City, purporting to depict the founding of the New York City Anti-Slavery Society, featuring the Boston abolitionist and newspaper editor William Lloyd Garrison and the New York businessman and philanthropist Arthur and Louis Tappan. So this is supposed to be Garrison over here, that's my pointer, over here to far left, and then we have Louis Tappan and Arthur Tappan. To the men's left, an emaciated West Indian slave, gaunt with hunger and adorned with palm leaves, again a symbol, so you know we're in the West Indies, at the waist, hungrily chases an insect, calling out the word food. At Garrison's side sits a bundle of rags imported presumably from the British West Indies to print a newspaper called The Emancipator. Garrison's paper was called The Liberator. They're kind of confusing his newspaper with Tappan's newspaper, which is called The Emancipator, but that's not here nor there for the moment. He laments that instead of creating produce, the former slave has been reduced to the true lazzaroni, a contemporary slur for street people and beggars of Italy. A wistful Arthur Tappan tells Garrison that every means moral and religious must be attempted to elevate the former slave, thus proving immediate emancipation a success. On a pedestal to the right, see here to the right, sits a spotted house cat. It's supposed to be an idiom of a leopard cannot change its spots, and it's meant to refute Tappan's optimism. Writings on the pedestal itself compare abolitionism and immediatism to contemporary political upheavals sweeping Europe. And what it says here that you can't see, it says fanaticism brought the Inquisition upon Spain, beggary upon Italy, and may drench America in blood. There's my title. I've gotten to it right away. To the far left, the pictorial drives home this dire message with a spectacle. This is near the emaciated and emancipated slave. In the background, there are scenes of black slaves massacring whites amid fire and ruin. And the words that around them read insurrection in St. Domingo, a reference, of course, to Haiti, and cruelty, lust, and blood. All this surrounds the grisly scene. So this is the image here. The lithograph that appeared on New York streets that November took place against the backdrop of the anti-slavery struggle being waged an ocean away. That past August 1833, an Abolition Act passed in British Parliament had received royal assent and would take effect the next year on August 1st, 1834, freeing some 800,000 slaves, most of whom lived in the West Indies. A note on freeing here, freeing meant also that 20 million pounds would be given as reparations to slaveholders for the loss of their property, and it also meant that most of the slaves, except on a few islands, these former slaves would be forced into a coercive and exploitative apprenticeship system to exploit their labor. But again, another story for another chapter. The British Colonial Secretary Edward Stanley, rising to introduce the bill to English Parliament, called it a mighty experiment and predicted that the welfare of millions of men in a state of slavery in colonies not belonging to Britain would rest on the fate of the West Indies. The proximity of the British Caribbean colonies to the southern slaveocracies of the North American mainland certainly made emancipation in the West Indies an immediate concern. For pro-slavery advocates and anti-abolitionists, freedom in the nearby Caribbean evoked apocalyptic fears of slave insurrection that would inevitably spread to American soil. For abolitionists, the strategies utilized by British abolitionists and the mighty experiments soon to take place in the West Indies provided opportunities to forge an international anti-slavery movement. Through the coming year, contested visions of British emancipation clashed repeatedly in America in tracts, speeches, newspapers, and violent confrontations. And next slide, we're talking about the British West Indies. I'm talking here, of course, of islands like Jamaica, further east here, islands like here's Dominica, Barbados, of course, on Port Barbados, Trinidad, Grenada, these areas. If you notice, of course, here's Florida to show you the proximity. In the United States, black emancipation in the West Indies had long been viewed with apprehension, what Thomas Jefferson once referred to as a disease that needed to be contained. He's here talking about Haiti. In the 1790s, rebellion turned revolution in French Saint-Domingue had sent refugees streaming into American ports, carrying with them their slaves, and it was feared the embers of insurrection, much like a plague. The governor of South Carolina in 1793 issued a proclamation requiring and ordering all free Negroes and people of color arrived from Saint-Domingue to depart the state, deeming them dangerous to the public welfare and peace. A South Carolina congressman even claimed to uncover a plot to invade the South with a black army from Saint-Domingue who would stir up slave rebellion and subjugate the white citizenry. Panic over Saint-Domingue seemed validated with insurrection plots by Gabriel Prosser in Virginia in 1800 and Denmark Vesey in South Carolina in 1822, both influenced by the Haitian example. In their wake, South Carolina passed repressive measures meant to safeguard against perceived external threats. The most conspicuous was the Negro Seaman Act of 1822, requiring all free Negro employees on any vessel which might come into a South Carolina port be imprisoned until the vessel should be ready to depart. Failure to comply could render apprehended free black persons into absolute slaves to be sold as property. After a free black Jamaican sailor, Harry Elkinson, was imprisoned in Charleston, the British consul took the matter to American courts that eventually ruled the act unconstitutional and void. Though Elkinson was released, South Carolina mostly ignored the ruling and continued enforcement in a type of early move towards nullification in many ways, complaining of Great Britain sowing tares of discontent in the South. Discontent brewed as well on American soil. In 1829, the Boston abolitionist David Walker's incendiary appeal to the colored citizens of the world began appearing in southern ports. In his treatise, the black pamphleteer condemned white slaveholders as an unjust, jealous, unmerciful, and bloodthirsty set of beings, while extolling Haiti as the glory of the blacks and the terror of tyrants. I think I have a picture here of Walker's appeal, and David Walker is an amazing figure during this time period. Don't have time to go into him more, but this is his appeal. In the pamphlet's wake, both Georgia and North Carolina adapted their own Negro Seaman Acts. While finding the act unconstitutional, a judge ceded that much as a state guarded against pestilence, it held an equal right to legislate to prevent the influence of a moral contagion. So there's this metaphor here, black freedom in many ways being equated to a disease, right? A pestilence that can grow and spread and infect new regions. By the early 1830s, a new contagion threatened as news of British emancipation in the West Indies crossed the Atlantic. That Britain's emancipation would come by legislative decree and not revolutionary insurrection appeared to matter little to American slaveholders. Many had read accounts in the past 2 decades of slave rebellions in Barbados and Guyana. By early 1832, news reached of a Christmastime rebellion in Jamaica, led by the religiously inspired slave Samuel Sharp, later called the Baptist War. And this is important because it's after this rebellion, basically, that in the metropolitan London, they decide that they must move forward with some form of emancipation. And here's actually a picture of a state burning during this rebellion in Jamaica in 1832. In America, the imminent arrival of freedom in the English West Indies was treated by slaveholders and their sympathizers as a looming disaster. The Raleigh Register of North Carolina warned that in abolition's wake, the West Indies would become overrun with Negro sovereignty, whose contagion would rapidly spread into the southern states. Worse still was the effect on American advocates of abolition. A Virginia newspaper complained that the prospect of freedom had created a fanatical spirit in their northern neighbors. If not fanaticism, the imminent emancipation of Britain's slaves was a cause for excitement. The anti-slavery Quaker reformer Benjamin Lundy's newspaper, Genius of Universal Emancipation, I always love the name of that newspaper, by the way, was also reporting on the British campaign and the revolutionary events unfolding in the West Indies. When the Baptist War erupted on the island, Lundy blamed the violence on slaveholders, charging that West Indian planters were filled with what he called the demonic spirit of oppression and would not be driven towards emancipation until the blacks, being painfully wearied and their patience exhausted, determined to take the matter into their own hands. Lundy had expressed similar views in the wake of another recent rebellion, this one just months prior in Southampton, Virginia. And I'm referring to Nat Turner's insurrection in 1831 Virginia. So think of these things all happening around the same time. While deploring Turner's violence, Lundy warned Southerners slavery was an incubator of insurrection. Now he similarly named the Jamaican planters stubborn tyrants who would not yield while the possibility exists of holding onto the rod, noting at the same time that the oppressed are determined that they shall wield it no longer. Such murderous calamities were the wages of oppression, Lundy said, sown by the tyrants of the West Indian colonies and likewise those tyrants in Virginia. Southern slave owners made their own connections. In a popular pamphlet, the writer Samuel Warner claimed Nat Turner had enticed followers with stories of the happy effects of which had attended the united efforts of their brethren in Santo Domingo, and had set out to accomplish the total extermination of the whites, so that, as in Haiti, the blacks of Virginia could establish a government of their own. Southerners also saw working in concert the hand of Northern agitators. William Lloyd Garrison and his newly published Liberator were singled out for particular condemnation. The Richmond Enquirer asked readers to be on the watch for any copies of the Liberator or Walker's Appeal, while Southern legislatures offered bounties on Garrison. Garrison had his own response to Nat Turner. In a September 1831 article, he denounced the violence of the rebellion, but he also held slaveholders responsible for making violent rebellion inevitable. As he put it, the slaves need no incentives at our hands. They will find them in their stripes, in their emaciated bodies, in their ceaseless toil. Garrison's commentary came just months before the Baptist War in Jamaica. American newspapers, which had reported in detail on Turner's rebellion, warned readers a great crisis was slowly building throughout the West Indies, and spoke of anxious planters living in dread of midnight acts of violence at the hands of vengeful slaves. When news of the Baptist War arrived, white Americans already unsettled by black rebellion in Virginia saw at work a larger pattern of tumult and unrest. Northern papers devoted detailed coverage to the Jamaican rebellion through the first half of 1832. Curiously, Southern papers, in contrast, made bare mention. It was almost as if the quarantine of moral contagion from the West Indies appeared now extended to even the printed word. But if Southerners sought to douse the embers of Caribbean revolt with silence, they made their fears known in other ways. In 1832, Florida, the state closest to the West Indies, joined the Carolinas and Georgia in passing its own Negro Seaman Act, threatening imprisonment and even slavery for violators. For Southern slaveholders still reeling from the twin threats of David Walker's Appeal and Nat Turner's Rebellion, events in the nearby West Indies appeared to be moving at a rapidly disastrous pace. Garrison and the Liberator, increasingly enmeshed within a transatlantic struggle, soon came to embody the contagion many long feared. So here's a picture of William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. Early in 1832, Garrison had founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society in Boston. The aims of the organization were ambitious: to effect the abolition of slavery in the United States, to improve the character and condition of the free people of color, to inform and correct public opinion in relation to their situation and rights, and to obtain for them equal civil and political rights and privileges with the whites. The organization reflected Garrison's growth on both anti-slavery and black citizenship. That spring, he issued his thoughts on African colonization, revising his earlier support for the movement. I think I have a picture on my slides. There's a picture from the American Colonization Society, an organization founded in, I believe it's 1817. Basically, their goal of fixing what they consider the slavery problem in the United States is to mostly entice free African Americans to move voluntarily, if they will, elsewhere, most probably to a colony in West Africa, right? And as you can imagine, African Americans have various views on this. The pamphlet drew on the anti-colonization arguments of earlier African-American pamphleteers and quoted directly from African-American newspapers, deriding the American Colonization Society, which I'll use as ACS because it's easier to say from now on, as an organization of deceptive assurances, unrelenting prejudices, and unchristian denunciations, aligned with the interests of Southern slaveholders, in some cases even funded by them. Since the early 1820s, the ACS had sought to cultivate British allies, hoping the English colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa would develop close ties with their fledgling colony of Liberia. Between 1832 and 1833, the ACS agent Elliot Preston traveled to England to promote the cause, earning initial support from the English abolitionist Thomas Clarkson. Here's my thoughts on African colonization slide. Garrison, at the same time, was increasing his contacts with Britain's abolitionist leadership. In the preamble of his thoughts on African colonization, he urged Americans would do well to imitate the example of the people of Great Britain by seeking the immediate overthrow of the horrid system, as was now being attempted in the West Indies. Some English reformers, like the Liverpool abolitionist James Cropper, were skeptical of the ACS. The African-American abolitionist Baptist minister, Reverend Nathaniel Paul of New York, was already in England, where he spoke out against both Crescent and colonization. So was the Anglo-Canadian abolitionist Charles Stewart, who circulated pamphlets and tracts to counter Crescent's influence. When Garrison's thoughts on African colonization arrived in England in 1833, Cropper, Paul, and Stewart seized on it to denounce the ACS. Paul lamented in a letter to Garrison that his own regret was that the pamphlet had not come sooner. In March of 1833, the Liberator announced that the New England Anti-Slavery Society had appointed William Garrison as their agent, and that he was heading to England. Why not? Might as well go while your pamphlet's hot. The goal of the trip was twofold: to raise funds for a proposed manual labor school for colored youth, and second, for the express purpose of, as he put it, disseminating in that country the truth in relation to American slavery and its ally, the American Colonization Society, not mincing words. Garrison's trip was financed in no small part by African Americans, who had been the Liberator's key subscribers, and who in their own publications had long been following the British emancipation campaign. So in many ways, they see this international struggle that Garrison's being involved in as their own. And as Manisha Sinha has pointed out in one of her books, I know she hates it when I quote her in the audience, in many ways Garrison, menteed under African American activists and others in his evolving of ideas. Garrison arrived in England in late May. Just 8 days previous, on May 14th, the colonial British Secretary Edward Stanley had risen in the House of Commons to move a sitting resolution for emancipation. Garrison spent both spring and summer in England and was received favorably by the abolitionist community, developing close relationships with the reformer George Thompson and the fiery Irish liberator Daniel O'Connell, another interesting character. In the midst of this emancipation fervor, Garrison mostly abandoned his initial goal of fundraising and focused on his secondary objective, exposing the ACS. With the aid of Cropper, Stewart, and Paul, and Thompson, Garrison sought out and publicly denounced Eliot Crescent in lectures and editorials, openly challenging him to debate on colonization. Garrison's added voice proved successful, and he was able to get a written protest by some of Britain's most prominent abolitionists that the ACS was not deserving of the countenance of the British people. Garrison's trip to England helped set the stage for a growing international abolitionist movement. In June 1833, the Liberator proclaimed exultation of the glorious triumph which must shortly be resounded over the death of British colonial slavery, decrying the humiliation and scorn America must feel for its own audacious crime of man-stealing. It invited Britain to pour out their tremendous rebukes of America's guilt and insulting mockery for the enormities of slavery. American abolitionists, Garrisonians in particular, were tying themselves both to the anti-slavery movement in England and the subsequent outcome of that campaign in the Caribbean colonies. In so doing, they as well tied themselves to the fears unleashed by the radical prospect of black freedom. In the United States, by 1833, mainstream publications, including many northern newspapers, disparaged this building transnational abolitionist movement. The North American Magazine, published by the New England poet Sumner Lincoln Fairfield in an 1833 pro-colonization society article, heaped scorn on what he called the frenzied fanaticism of Garrison, frenzied with a PH, which I see a lot here, which is weird, and the irrational and inhuman anti-slavery society for its attacks on American slaveholders, who he called chivalrous self-runners or some sort. To instantly emancipate the millions of degraded, brutal slaves, the article railed, was comparable to liberating the hyena and jaguar. Garrison was accused of encouraging slaves to plunder and burn at will and to fertilize the fields of the South with the mangled bodies of their masters. Anxieties over racial amalgamation were never far from these conjurations. The true motive of abolitionists like Garrison, the article maintained, was to promote interracial marriage and to live in a state of polygamy. A commentary titled West India Slavery derided Garrison and English abolitionists as mischief workers and madmen, whose frantic disciples spread false depictions of the Caribbean islands to the ignorant and prejudiced in both England and America. The changes unfolding on the Western Isles were labeled of special concern to the United States, given the ceaseless efforts of disorganizing zealots to depopulate the South and sever the Union. American newspapers took special note of Garrison's speeches in England. The New York Commercial Advertiser charged, Mr. Garrison had not only published his own opinions on the subject of slavery in England, but has published British opinions on the subject in America. Worse still, Garrison had openly cultivated British abolitionists to take a direct hand in undermining American slavery. While in London, he published another tract, Slavery in the United States of America, this appeal to the Friends of Negro Emancipation. Within, Garrison rebuked guilty America and spoke harrowingly on Southern slavery. It is impossible that the British people, Garrison beseeched, proudly standing as they now are upon the neck of colonial slavery, to consider their work at an end, while there remains a human being held as chattel under the whole heavens. Garrison's enemies seized on these accounts, labeling he and his allies enemies of the Republic, whose dangerous and foreign doctrines of emancipation, black equality, and racial boundary crossing threatened to undo the nation. The sum misery to our country, the North American magazine bemoaned, should their project succeed, will be incalculable. An August 1833 article in the Baptist Repository Periodical advised the only means to stop the frenzy, again with a PH, caused by Garrison and his supporters was by cutting off their heads, so that this slavery agitation may subside, and our country sleep another half-century over the volcano. In the heightened era of Jacksonian nationalism, immediate emancipation seemed an alien notion, a new moral contagion, and from its earliest inception, they determined to stamp it out. On October 1st, 1833, a group of pro-colonizationists met in the Manhattan office of Watson Webb, editor of the Courier and Inquirer. The daily broadsheet was the consequence of a merger of Webb's New York Morning Courier with the playwright and editor Mordecai Noah's New York Inquirer in 1832. New York's African-American community had been a frequent target of Noah's publications, in which he campaigned against black suffrage, mocked the local African-American theater company, parodied black print literature, and championed blackface minstrelsy. Webb, a nativist and sometimes Jacksonian Democrat, who boasted of being an Indian fighter, he's his own particular character, engaged in similar racial rhetoric. By 1833, the Courier and Inquirer had become the city's most well-read newspaper, broadening its diatribes to include the emerging abolitionist movement which Webb zealously opposed. Inspired by the passage of British emancipation, the wealthy abolitionist brothers Arthur and Louis Tappan, who we've seen on the first slide there, called together a multiracial gathering at Clinton Hall to inaugurate the formation of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. This coincided with the return of Garrison from England, who was expected to address the audience. Both Garrison and Arthur Tappan were regular targets for Webb. Stinging from the recent rebuke of the ACS abroad and fearing British-style movements for immediate emancipation at home, Webb and his allies resolved to invade the abolitionist meeting and put a stop to what he termed wicked fanatics. In an October 2nd morning editorial, Webb openly stoked public sentiment. The notorious Garrison has returned among us, and the good people of this city are called upon to partake in his mad schemes for exciting the South against the North by an interference with their slaves, which are calculated to destroy the Union of States and bring upon us all the horrors of civil war. Webb denounced the confluence of British emancipation and racial amalgamation and American abolitionism as a many-headed hydra, a monstrous foreign danger that blurred both national, sexual, and racial boundaries. Are we tamely to look on and see this most dangerous species of fanaticism extending itself through our society, he asked? Or shall we, by promptly crushing this many-headed hydra, expose the weakness as well as the folly, madness, and mischief of these bold and dangerous men? That evening, a raucous crowd, some numbers have gone from 1,000 to more than that, converged on Clinton Hall, provoked and encouraged by placards posted throughout the city addressed to all persons from the South and patriots. The mob stormed the building, hunting for Tappan and Garrison, but Arthur Tappan had changed the meeting place earlier that morning to nearby Chapman Street Chapel. The frustrated mob retired to the downtown headquarters of Tammany Hall, where speaker after speaker took to the podium to rail against abolitionism, foreign influencing, and race mixing. Learning of the encroaching danger, the abolitionists gathered and passed their resolutions and broke early. The mob, now worked into a frenzy, took to the streets shouting, "Garrison, Garrison, Tappan, Tappan, where are they? Find them, find them." Men armed with Bowie knives and pistols roamed the city, bearing placards, interestingly, with the names of southern states. Most of the abolitionists managed to escape the violence, though the Tappans barely slipped away. I think they ended up being saved by a janitor or custodian who helps him slip away. The following day, Webb boasted of the mob's success against the malignant busybodies who misrepresented the sentiments of the city. All right, so his newspaper is basically crowing these triumphant headlines: "The agitators defeated, the Constitution triumphant," and he celebrates the mob as patriots who had put down the desperate band of fanatics. The citizens of New York, Webb commended, had acted to show their detestation for any attempt to organize an anti-slavery society in the city, right, fraught with danger to the Union. Webb remarked that the mob's tactics cannot fail to have a salutary effect upon those who have sought to throw a firebrand into the community, a warning that alien notions of immediate emancipation, amalgamation, and black equality had no place within the constructed identity of American nationalism. Let them take a lesson from the proceedings of last night, Webb boasted, and avoid tampering with the feelings of an outraged and insulted community. In contrast, Garrison, returned from England, saw the violence as the surest evidence abolitionists walked the correct moral path. Speaking on the riots, he charged, "The success of my mission in England seems to have driven the enemies of slavery in the abstract to the verge of madness. They who cannot wield the pen against us resort to tar and feathers and clubs. Miserable wretches, they know not what they do." Inspired by the National British Anti-Slavery Society, Garrison resolved to create a similar organization in the United States on a national level. Arthur Tapan, unnerved by the recent attacks, advocated postponement, but Garrison and Lewis Tapan argued a new national society had to be formed, while the victory of British emancipation was still fresh. On December 4th, 1833, 60 delegates, black and white, met in Philadelphia to found the American Anti-Slavery Society, part of a new struggle to transform the social and racial fabric of America. Meanwhile, the riot in New York that past October was followed by sustained attacks in print, which returns us to where we started, our good old slide, immediate emancipation illustrated. This slide, pictorial purporting to depict the founding of the New York City Anti-Slavery Society. It appeared on the streets later that month, repeating the familiar fear-mongering that had been stoked by Webb's Courier and Inquirer. The caricatures of Garrison and Tapan, their association with British emancipation in the West Indies, and the ominous warning of importing slave rebellion that may drench America in blood. The starving West Indian slave that we talked about, you see the one chasing the insect, was likely a recreation of a pictorial published in England that previous May titled "An Emancipated," an Emancipated Negro, I guess it's both the same to them. And this is that pictorial, so you see the image there, it's the same thing that they've recreated. The pictorial similarly displayed a gaunt and famished West Indian slave chasing an insect with a dagger held poised in his hand. So, see the dagger on that side, it's easier said, but he's also not only chasing the slave, but he has a dagger in his other hand. The appearance of the drawing on New York streets illustrated the ways in which anti-abolitionist propaganda as well on the British West Indies migrated across the Atlantic, so it's not just one thing. It also made clear the claimed dangers posed by black freedom both in the Caribbean and the American South, the ruin of the plantation economies, and the unleashing of a dangerous population. In response, Arthur Tapan and the New York Anti-Slavery Society hastily put together a 46-page pamphlet titled "Address of the New York City Anti-Slavery Society to the People of the City of New York," to give a frank explanation of their principles and plans. And I think I have a picture of that, yeah. The tract defended immediate emancipation as a safe remedy, and the West Indies as an example of success. However new the doctrine of immediate emancipation may appear to some, there is abundant evidence that such a measure does not involve danger or loss to the emancipated, or to the community, it is short. We cannot find a single instance in which emancipation has been tried, that one drop of white blood has been shed, or even endangered by it, white blood being a very precious commodity during this time. To those who claim the abolitionists invited ruin upon America with their appeals to foreign principles, there was a candid response. If abolition societies should suspend their operations immediately, it will not hinder every slave in the United States from speedily learning that his brethren in the West Indies are free. We trust in the candor of our fellow citizens that this enlightened community will pronounce an upright judgment when they become fully acquainted with our views. Despite these overtures, the streets of New York saw even starker anti-abolitionist violence the following year, 1834, which I'm not going to go into because But those, they actually, the Farron riots, they actually go after British performers, and they actually make one British performer, they start tearing up the theater, and they make him start singing a blackface minstrel song before they let him go. American abolitionists were shaken by this violence, but continued the championing of British emancipation and freedom in the West Indies as a strategy to win liberty at home. And when I say championing, this may be a bit complicated, as I spoke about in the beginning, because of the compensation of slaveholders, the apprenticeship system. They are critical of that. There is a criticism of there's a difference in times of American abolitionists championing what British abolitionists want as opposed to what the British government is doing, right? So don't want to think of them as Anglophiles. In July of 1835, almost 1 year after the enactment of the British Abolition Act and a second spate of riots in New York City, the American Anti-Slavery Society passed a resolution calling for the observance of the 1st of August annually as a day of thanksgiving to God and the cause of our oppressed countrymen and the abolition of slavery in the British West Indian Islands. The commemoration signaled a new direct phase of American anti-slavery, simultaneously forging stronger transatlantic bonds between the United States, England, and the British Caribbean. During this crucial campaign for Northern public opinion, American abolitionists would fight to win the war over the popular image of the liberated West Indies, stressing emancipation as an act of economic progress, moral reform, and the path to greater participatory democracy. And going to end. Sure. Oh.
You can direct,
yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, that was great. I was thinking as I was listening to you talk that it seems sort of staggering to think that this story has not been told this way before. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how the West Indies and British emancipation have come into the story of American anti-slavery and abolitionism heretofore, and why do you think that there hasn't? Why do you think that there hasn't been more attention to it, I guess?
Right. Well, you know, on the one hand, I think there's been, I'll say this, I think my first learnings of abolitionism and its understanding of it beyond the national struggle, I think one thing is Americans kind of navel-gazing as thinking of ending slavery and thinking of it, yes, as an American thing and as a nationalist thing. I did start reading, however, even in undergrad, people speaking of more transnational ideas, but it was normally between the metropoles. It was often of American abolitionists who journeyed to England and the influence of that, right? And so the West Indies itself would kind of be in the background and kind of sometimes left out there. And it was actually in graduate school that I first learned about these August 1st celebrations, right? And reading some works, and I was like, what is this? There are these August 1st celebrations, these massive celebrations that abolitionists would hold during the 19th century of British emancipation in the West Indies, and they called it sometimes West India Day, and it was not part of the popular discourse that I'd come across before. There had been work done on it, often in looking at forms of creating political identity of African Americans in the North. And I think it was historian Jeffrey Carici was the first person I saw who actually did an entire book on August 1st. And I think this was like around 2006, 2007. And even though that book was really popular, I still think at times it doesn't filter into the larger popular understanding of abolitionism to see it that way. And so there have been historians who have looked at this international movement. There's another, Caleb McDaniel at Rice University has looked at how people like William Lloyd Garrison are making these connections with a lot of the revolutionary movements happening in Europe. And so that there has been this kind of work, but my work is unique, of course. Because what I'm trying to do is I'm really trying to bring the West Indies into this. And so even what this little bit I've given you here is part of a larger chapter. And in that chapter, I'm looking at how these fears of black freedom playing out as well in the English metropole, how they play out in the West Indian Islands themselves, what legislatures in Jamaica and Barbados and others are dealing with during this time, and I'm trying to vagrancy laws and other things they're trying to pass. And I'm trying to also, hopefully successfully, show how this impacts the fears that come to the United States, right? And so this part of the chapter right here actually is right after I've discussed what's happening in the West Indies proper. And so I hope that I'm adding to this discourse that is, I think there's been work done, but I do definitely think there needs to be more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems only natural. Like, you're not that far removed from when the West Indies were part
Right.
of the same empire.
Right, yes. And so the Caribbean plays this role, sure.
So I think this is was wonderful. This question is a little weird, but I was actually really interested in the word fanaticism comes up like 10 times in your talk.
Yeah.
And I was thinking it's a weird word. And it's a particular word that they keep moving back and forth to, and I was thinking actually then about sort of thinking about the word hysteria, and the word that hysteria at the end of the 19th century becomes of course very gender specific, and becomes sort of this dialogue about bodies and containing bodies. Does fanaticism have any kind of regional or geographic or racial, like it's just, to me it strikes me as like, I mean, and I'm from Philadelphia, so I'm Philly fanatics, but but it's a really particular word to talk about what's going on here.
And frenzy.
Yeah, yeah. So like a lot of this sort of, they just strike me as odd.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I don't know specifically, but you're right. I do see it. Abolitionists are constantly called fanatics, right? And I suppose if you think about what they're proposing here, that free African Americans can be part of, the turn to immediate abolitionism. One of these main things, especially for Garrisonians, is that it's not only that we're trying to end slavery, but what then in the post-emancipation society, these free people now have to become citizens, right? And this is a radical idea. If you're thinking of Jacksonian democracy, which is basically defining it as white men are citizens and the ones who should participate, right? This is the whole point of the ACS, the American Colonization Society, is that even the best meaning members of the American Colonization Society is that people like you just can't make it here, right? You don't belong in this society. You cannot possibly compete with white people. You can't compete with white men, and so you should go somewhere else for your own good, right? Your societies. They say your societies are littered with crime. They start publishing all these crime tracts of the black community. They basically say you're living in these hellholes, and yes, the quote, some modern things. They say, what do you have to lose, right? You can just go. And so I would think that what the abolitionists are saying, I think what I believe you're capturing here is that people do think this is fanatic. This is crazy, right? This is what you're proposing here is beyond the pale. And it seems like if you can label people fanatics, you devalue them. And I think there's also a way, even in this, to go back to this, where it talks about fanaticism, this is also an era of the 1830s, 1840s. There are also these upheavals happening in Europe, right? These revolutionary upheavals. And there's a way in which even here they link it to this, right? They talk about that this has brought beggary to Italy. They're talking about the various revolutions happening in Italy to unify Italy. They're talking about the various Carlos Wars about to start in Spain, and they're looking at what's happening here, and they're kind of linking it the same. It's almost like, they're almost calling them Jacobins in some. And in fact, they will at times call these folks Jacobins to talk about harkening back to the French Revolution. So I think there's some relationship.
And religious sort of, like is that in any religious sort of connotation to fanaticism as well?
I don't know. That's a good question. There's certainly religious people making critiques here. Right. One of those critiques I think where he's friendly comes from the Baptist periodical, who also calls for cutting their heads off. Very, very Baptist. Yeah.
I just wanted to add an exclamation point to Kate's comment, because when I teach the history of capitalism, it's so, when I teach a period, there's these fluid links, these financial links between the American West and Great Britain and the Caribbean, and it seems remarkable that the intellectual political links haven't been treated in the same way. I guess money leads everything. But I'm wondering about the sense of national threat, and if there's a difference between the way the Americans are reading this and the way that it's being read in Great Britain, that emancipation for Great Britain doesn't seem like a national threat in the way that it does in the United States, and maybe that explains some of the disconnect, or is there?
So yeah, I mean, you're correct, and it's like there are several things there. Like one, the part about the business interest, certainly, white people in New York would be very upset that you might be causing problems with. By the 1830s is where we're going to get the cotton boom. So, we have people here, you have banks and investors linked to these southern industries who see immediate emancipation as a problem. You also have them linked to the West Indies. They export things to the West Indies. I know here in Connecticut, for instance, I think in the 1820s, Connecticut is like exporting cattle to like Jamaica, right? And so there are all these, and so there are these links. We're in the Industrial Revolution coming up where Britain itself is going to be very dependent on Southern cotton, right, during this period. And we're seeing manufacturers starting. That's, by the way, one of the most interesting things. And I think of places like Abington in Massachusetts, where they have like these huge August 1st celebrations, but it also has all these textile mills that's using cotton from the South, and so they both are there to stop slavery, but also the economy there is becoming dependent on this slave-produced cotton, showing the way, as you pointed out, it's intermeshed, and it's not just nationally, but it's intermeshed globally, right, in many different ways. I lost my train of thought on the second part of your question.
National threat.
Yeah, the national threat. And so, certainly in many ways, this is something that both detractors of the West Indian emancipation in Britain and the United States say. They say, look, you can emancipate, Britain can emancipate in the West Indies because it's far removed. Right? What happens in the West Indies is happening over there to the island race, right? That's happening over there. And certainly there is the belief that they will lose the colonies. Some say, the colonies will go to ruin, and it will financially ruin them. Sugar is very lucrative. They're doing it at a time when they're still making a lot of wealth over this, and it's left a lot of historians and economic historians pondering why do this at this time. I'm not going to go down that long, arduous, torturous argument. But certainly in doing so, there is that concern. But if there's a concern with the idea of fear and a threat, for Britain, we'll see this threat, the idea of threat and fear comes from the islands themselves, the colonies themselves, right? This is what the colonists say. This is what the planters say. Like, if you do this, we'll be doomed, right? It won't work. We will face actual violence at times, some of them evoke. You can see if different being in the United States where the South is not removed, right? Slavery is not an ocean away, right? And so for people like Webb and others who basically use this fear-mongering, to them the threat is right there, right? The threat of releasing the slaves is different. And they often make this point. They say Britain can do what it wants in its colonies. They don't have to live with black people, right? They don't have to live with free black people. But here in the United States, we do. And so they use this as a tactic, right? And it's interesting because it's also a tactic that's going to be used by free African Americans, right? One of the things free African Americans, they'll immediately attack the ACS and say, they seem to be living fine with free black people in Barbados, so how come you can't live fine with them here in Philadelphia and New York, right? And so you'll see different people will use these things to their own ends, right? They use the West Indies to their own ends, which is a larger part of the project, yeah. Yes?
So I want to go back to the language, because some of the language in the rhetoric that you were reporting just jumped out at me since I'm working on topic speech, right?
I thought you would like that.
Yeah, I did. I'm like, okay, we're having a talk, but not right now. So contagion and pestilence.
Yes.
And so I just want to invite you to maybe say a little bit more of that, because I'm thinking about how in the 20th century, and for people who don't know me, I'm not a historian, so please bear with me. But in the 20th century, during the civil rights movement and until today, some of that language is still inherent in racist discourse. This idea that people of different races have different degrees of health and are contagious, that they should not be living together. And so, like, I don't know exactly when the things like swimming pools became desegregated. I saw a wonderful photograph from Kennywood in Pittsburgh where some black activists, it was a whites-only pool, and they threw balloons filled with blue dye into the pool. So when the white people came out, they all looked blue. And then they were colored. Colored in quotes. But I'm digressing on that. I'm just saying that was in like the 1960s, maybe or late 50s, but sometime in the 60s. as a civil rights protest. And the idea that somehow you would be contaminated if you were in the same swimming pool gets at that idea of pestilence from perfectly normal, healthy people, right? So I'm wondering if there is actually, this is where the historical question comes in, could we, I'm not saying this is your project, trace the rhetoric straight up till now? Do you, given the research you've done so far, do you think it's traceable? Is that a project?
I don't know, but I hope there are grad students in here. And I mean, I don't know, but certainly I was struck by that, right? I think it's one of the first things that I was struck at, this notion of contagion, these words like pestilence that are used, again, a lot of it begins with things in San Domingo, right? That's where you often see this, even from Thomas Jefferson calling what's happening in San Domingo a disease, and he says it has to be contained. And so there is this language there. I mean, this is also an era where biological racism is pretty much ascendant, and so I don't know if there is a direct line, but certainly it's something. I haven't thought about it like that, but I've been struck by the often use of this notion of black freedom as related to a contagion, something to contaminate. I mean, in that sense, many of them are talking about it as in, well, we're worried that you will bring insurrection here, and that this can happen. Right, it's a social contagion.
You'll get the idea that maybe you can be free too.
But in the larger metaphor, I don't know. But it's an interesting question. Yeah.
I actually had a question that builds directly off of what I said.
Great.
I was thinking as you were talking about the contagion metaphor and its uses, is it also biological? Is there a line to draw to drapetomania, to the idea, like a pro-slavery argument that American enslaved people don't have an inherent will to freedom, but can be poisoned by...
That's it. And when you say that, and now you're making me think of like the ACS, they're talking about these free black communities, and one of the things they do, I'm remembering, they talk about them as disease. Right? The free black communities in Philadelphia, they say are filled with disease, and we'll see this often, even in Baltimore. There are issues of quarantining, when disease breaks out, quarantine the black population. And so there is, it's like you guys are jogging my memory now, my academic memory. There is this talk of these free black communities as being centers of disease. And I remember reading certain parts in Baltimore, some of these things they follow in concert, because what they're doing is they're packing free people from Baltimore into poor, squalid areas, and so disease breaks out, and they say, aha, you're diseased, right? So these self-fulfilling prophecies in some way. So I don't know if that makes it relatable to the notion of freedom as a disease, but this does come along with notions of biological racism, I think, yes. The notion that these populations may carry disease in that sense, more than just social disease, but physical disease and contamination. And certainly we can extend the metaphor and say they believe they will contaminate American democracy, right? This is why they should not participate. Yes.
I guess to piggyback off of both of those comments, the term polygamist in reference, I think Webb, you mentioned, in reference to Garrison, I found pretty shocking. Do you see that elsewhere? Or
there's a lot of. In fact, I didn't go down the entire rabbit hole there, but let's just say they also accuse him that he has a black wife. This comes out of an abolitionist. I believe it's his child in Boston, who at this time has recently written a pamphlet arguing against laws against interracial marriage, and so they seize upon that. And it's interesting you say that, because I've been trying to develop, and I've been almost successful, not there, develop these notions that I see kind of here and there of the West Indies as a miscegenated space. I've been thinking of the West Indies as this place where there's all of this interracialness. The free black people there they often refer to them as mulattoes and octoroons and what have you. And there is I think there's this tie that I haven't been able to exactly put it together. I think I'd love to see some novels or literature of the period, or even travel narratives where they're talking about the West Indies, to see if there is this link when they're talking about the ideas of race mixing, which they use to fearmonger with Garrison and others, if there's also a link of them thinking of the West Indies as this space where there's all this quote-unquote miscegenation going on. Yeah. And I don't know if I have time to...
I think one more question.
Yes. Whoever would like to. Everybody's so polite.
Well, since we're in this space and we're talking about like civility and public discourse, I'm wondering what that I'm wondering about the evolution, because anti-slavery has been around, anti-slavery rhetoric and propaganda has been around for much longer. And I'm wondering, what is the space in which polite society would have been willing to sort of countenance some anti-slavery rhetoric without the pestilential, contagious version of it? So what's the polite way to be an abolitionist?
Well, probably it's not to be an abolitionist. I don't know. I mean, people. It's complicated, right? And even these abolitionists here I'm showing here are not on the. They're about to not be on the same page in a few years as far as the tactics and what have you. But there are ways in which American Colonization Society offers that, right? They're like, you know, in some way they say we can be an organization that wants to promote the end of slavery. That is the removal of black people, mostly free black people, though they essentially say it will eventually happen to enslaved people as well, but to remove them from the country, right? And so and before this, there were gradual attempts at emancipation, what have you, but it's not as if all those things were met with thunderous applause, right? They were always you see free African Americans continuously pushing the envelope and pressing for rights, equal rights, or pressing for the end of slavery, and they are often met with resistance, right? So there's a way in which I don't know how they might have, what level of anti-slavery might have been framed as acceptable, but it is interesting that many of the detractors of abolitionism will say they are also anti-slavery, right? Many of them will, especially in the North, they say, look, we're not pro-slavery, right? We just don't believe that blacks should have equal rights, right? We want to see slavery end as much as anyone else, but we don't want to see it at the expense of severing the Union and ruining economic and political ties, right? How earnest they all are on that, I can't say, right? But certainly they make those arguments, right? Often you'll see this. They say, we are not pro-slavery figures, but what the abolitionists are proposing is a step too far. I just have the sneaking suspicion that any step that was out of line to it, moving black people outside the United States altogether or keeping them subjugated to slavery might have been a step too far to them. That's my opinion.
Well, please join us in continuing this conversation at a reception immediately following, and thanking Dexter Gabriel.